right, and now we'll talk about kind of the natural results of this empire that Rome built when we ended off first half of Rome, first part of Rome. So you have economic results, and we'll talk about the economic problems that the Roman Empire starts experiencing, and how that leads to a realignment of political parties and factions, and eventually leads to civil war amongst those parties and politicians. So the creation of this empire and the stresses it puts on the Roman government have long ripple effects and results for the rest of Roman history, and puts them into a series of problems that in a lot of ways they won't really find solutions for. So first with the economy, this is, again in red, this is what the Roman government or the Roman Empire looks like by about the year 145, 146 BCE, when they're finished desecrating, destroying Carthage, and conquering much of Greece by this point. So the Roman Empire is large. It has grown beyond its Italian homeland, and that has natural economic effects that we can even see going on. A political effect, though, is that this Roman government that was originally built to govern a city now has to govern this gigantic empire over many different cultures and languages and groups, ethnicities, figure out how to not just keep control over them, but to keep them from fighting back, to stop them from wanting to start revolutions. And their idea is to try to take this city council type democratic government that they had for the city of Rome itself and try to transition that structure to govern this gigantic empire. So they alter it a little bit, but the fundamentals of the Roman government are still in place. The Roman lawmakers have a one-year term of office, and they cannot run for immediate re-election. So the theory becomes, if you run for office in 2016 and you're elected, and you serve as a lawmaker, you're a senator for a year in 2017, you are an expert in the laws that the government has been passing while you're in office. You were there, you helped do this, or you argued against it. Either way, you know about these laws. So the idea becomes to, since you can't run for re-election, you're going to be out of office for a year, why not send you out to the provinces, these places that Rome has conquered, like in Iberia or North Africa or Greece or wherever else, and put you into like an administrative position, kind of like a governor of one of these areas, to enforce Roman laws on those areas. You're out of office for a year anyway, and you're an expert in the laws, so this seems like a good solution. Does it make sense? It seems logical on that level. Because you're going to have someone out there running the place. Number two, it gets powerful politicians the hell out of the city for a year. Does that make sense? Because the Romans are, by this point, kind of inherently afraid that some politician or other is going to get so popular that he's going to overthrow the whole system and set up a new dictatorship, make himself a new king. Does that make sense? So, these politicians that have just been elected and they serve for office, get them out of the city for a while so that they cannot build that long-term popularity. Does that make sense? And they can't, if you send them out to the provinces, they're going to be far away from each other. They can't really communicate with each other anymore, not at least easily. So they can't build political alliances that might create like a political party that could overthrow the government and take over. Does that make sense? So it accomplishes two kind of theoretical things. Number one, you send the experts out to actually enforce laws. And number two, you get maybe threatening politicians the hell out of the place for a while. You make it difficult for them to come together and form conspiracies. Does that make sense? Okay. So the system they put in place is to, send them out to the provinces for that year, at least. And this seems to kind of serve the needs of this new empire, while still running according to their kind of foundational laws. Does it make sense? Yeah.
Well, didn't they have like trumps? Wouldn't the army be there for that?
Trumps,
Like trumps,
something to overcome it?
that? No, like when they like won a lot, they would have like a huge procession or something like a ceremony.
Yeah, but that's only for a little while. That's only for, especially in the city of Rome, it's only for a day. So generals are celebrated, but just like today, after a general wins a big war, they usually retire. So generals at this point in Roman history are not really politicians themselves. They don't run for office. They serve in the army, they do their job, they win a campaign or they win a battle or something, and they're honored and they go into retirement. So they don't seem to be a threat yet. They will be in the future. By the end of tonight, they'll be a definite threat, but not so much at this point. Does that make sense? All right. The kind of reimagined system, though, to run this empire creates the next level of problem. And that is when you send these lawmakers out to the provinces, a lot of these lawmakers, they're just taking a year off from their political career. They want to get back in office. They want to run for re-election at some point. They're just kind of barred from doing that according to Roman law. So they have a year off, and they're sent out to this place that is like the wild, wild west, basically, where Roman families are going into and buying up cheap land and selling it for profit. They're buying up slaves. I mean, they're stealing property from the people they've conquered. I mean, it's like an investment bonanza for rich families. And now you put politicians involved in running this system that is just the biggest money maker in all of Roman economics. Does it make sense? And these politicians are sent out to be governor over a certain area, and there's money to be made everywhere, easy money to be made. And these governors take advantage of that. They make deals with Roman families to give them land in this newly conquered place, or to not tax them. Or even if there's tax laws on the books for these families that are, say, going into Iberia and buying up land, this new governor just doesn't collect the tax. And why might he refuse to collect the tax? Well, he wants to stay friends with that family, because that family will help bankroll his future campaign for office. Does that make sense? So you could call that bribery. It's taking money and doing favors. A lot of politicians don't want to call it bribery because it's a word politicians generally try to avoid because it's illegal and it's immoral and does only really enrich and empower the people that are already rich and powerful. A lot of these politicians also go out to the provinces, and sometimes they're out there to govern this, out in the boonies, and they just start stealing from the government treasury. Because who's going to stop them? The Roman government is back in the city of Rome. And if you're the governor of this far-flung place, 1,000 miles away, who's going to tell on you? And you have control of the army in that little locality. So you might punish people for writing letters that rat you out. Does that make sense? So the natural result is that these politicians that are looking to somehow get a bunch of money together to run for office and get reelected at some point in the future, they're stealing, they're taking bribes, they're doing favors. They even start kind of intermarrying with rich families. They're doing anything they can to get access to money to further their political career in the future. Does that make sense? So they are just inherently corrupt. And they do all kinds of crazy things with money, with government money and with business investment money, and there's just no one watching. Does that make sense? So they spend very often just 1 year in the province, and they return to Rome at the end of that year, and they've got a ton of money, and they run for re-election to the Senate. Say they run for re-election in 2016, they get elected, they serve in office in 2017. They can't run for re-election, so in 2018 they're sent out to the province to kind of run the newly conquered place, and they just get hold of money. They come back at the end of 2018 for the elections, and they run their campaign. They get elected again. They serve in office in the Senate in 2019, and it becomes what we today call the revolving door of politics.
Yeah, career politicians.
Yeah, they serve in one area for that term limit, then they go to another area and rebuild their wealth to get back to the first area, serve another term, go back to the provinces, and it's just a cycle. Does that make sense?
Is that how, what's his name? Crassus or whatever made all his money?
I don't know about the history of Crassus's family. I don't know Roman history on that depth of individual families. I'm just not an ancient scholar. So I don't have the information to answer that question. That's much better asked of one of our ancient historians, and we have two of them here at Chaffey right now. And they'll probably hire more at some point. But I don't know the details of it well enough to even answer that. But this is one of the ways that the very richest families just consolidate their wealth. And to them, this is a business investment, right? Does that make sense? So politics and economics are intertwined to a point that they just don't seem like they can be separated anymore. Or if you're going to try it, it's going to have to be like a big dramatic proposal. And there's accusations that this stuff still goes on today, even in the United States, where you have a vote, you have democracy. Who tends to win elections?
The rich.
Yeah. The people who either have money or they ask for money from other rich people. And that's what's corrupted your politics and your politicians today. I mean, to run for president of the United States, you have to have $1 billion. $1 billion, that's a lot of money. $1,000 million. To me, $1 million is a lot of money. Maybe that's just me. But $1 million times 1,000, that's... What do you do with that kind of money other than run for president, I guess? And if you don't have it, how do you get it? Beg rich people for money and make promises to them. If you give me money and I run a campaign and I win an election, maybe I'll lower your tax rate, or I'll let you get away with some pollution, or I'll start a war where we'll conquer some place somewhere that you want for your business. And we still today call it the revolving door, where politicians go in, they serve a term in Congress or in the White House, and then they go back to their banks or their investment companies or whatever businesses they run, and they work there for a few years, and they try to run for re-election, and they just run this cycle. And if you haven't noticed, it's like the same families that are running for these offices, right? Over generations, and by now over decades. These political families have been around in the United States for many decades. And you know, they're very smart. They know what they're doing. They know how to consolidate power. To the point now where most Americans seem to believe that you have one of two choices. You vote for this party or this party. And a lot of people like me look at two parties and say, what are the big differences here? They seem to want mostly the same stuff. Does that make sense? And they're very intelligent. They study how to accomplish this stuff. So systematic corruption in Rome and even today. Questions about any of this? Nope. Do you notice this stuff happening?
I remember my government class That was like a policy where politicians couldn't serve in an institution after.
Yep. And there's limits in office for the president. The president can only serve 2 terms, or at the very most 2.5 terms.
No, but like they couldn't. After they were done with their terms, they couldn't go through like a business and then go.
Yeah, that's been proposed also. That usually does not happen. Usually the people in Congress who vote on these laws, they vote against that stuff because they want to go back to banks and lobbying firms and whatnot, because that's how they make money.
It'll make it through the House, but it'll never pass the Senate, ever.
Well, the
Well, these-
leaderships of the House and Senate go back and forth, and that's been proposed often. Usually gets voted down. And leaders of both parties have proposed that at different times over the past few decades. So it's, but usually the people in their own party try to kill it off because they don't like it. This is how they make money.
Because you're asking people in power to limit their own power.
Yep.
Nobody who has power wants to give it up.
Yep. That's
Well, few people do.
that's one of the normal rules of politics and power. Those in power, they understand how they got there, and they want to make sure that that opportunity is always open for them. Does that make sense? The people who win the race are the least likely to vote to change the rules of the race. Does that make sense? Yeah. And there's many things you can cite as examples of that today and back then. The Romans have now conquered this gigantic empire, and it will keep growing as we continue talking about Rome for the next few weeks. It started up in Italy, and now has grown to the kind of surrounding islands, and now in Iberia, North Africa, and Greece. This has a real economic impact for the original Romans, for the original, or at least calling themselves maybe Italians by this point, the people in the Roman kind of homelands in the peninsula. When they took on loans to buy farms, to buy land, because most people, most workers in society in the ancient world are farmers. A lot of times, just like today, if you buy a house, you have to get a bunch of money together to buy that property, and you get what's today called a mortgage, and you have to pay that loan off a little bit at a time every month for however long. Does that make sense? You've heard of this before? You guys have maybe not bought houses, but bought cars? Yeah. So yeah, it's a loan for a set term of months, and you pay it off little by little. In order to make that big purchase, if you don't have $20,000 to buy a new car. Does that sound familiar to you? Okay. The problem is that a lot of Romans in Italy, when the Roman economy was booming, those land prices were going up. There's a lot of people trying to get loans to buy the same piece of land. So the person selling the land, they'll, just like houses and cars today, they sell it to the highest bidder because they want the most money they can get. Does that make sense? So in a booming economy, or at least a healthy economy, you tend to have a lot of bidders on one item. And if the seller's just going to sell to whoever offers the most money, they keep bidding up the price. Does that make sense? So the price of land in Italy, before this empire is created, price of land in Italy is skyrocketing. You have to take bigger and bigger and bigger loans to buy land. And the smaller time farmers who get these loans, they can actually buy the land because even at these really high prices, they can still farm the land enough to feed their family, and they eat the food off the farm, and they sell the rest at market in the farms and wherever else to make the cash, the money, to pay off their loans every month, to make their payments. Does that make sense? The problem that hits with the empire is that now Rome is beyond just Italy. They've conquered all these foreign places all around the periphery. And Roman investors basically go in at auction and they buy up giant chunks of land, say in Iberia or Greece, from these places they conquered, and they sell it. and they basically flood the market for land. And what happens to the price of anything when you suddenly increase the supply?
Negotiation.
Yeah, it goes down really fast. Like if I have one water bottle for this whole class and I say I want to sell it, someone out there is going to bid a really high price because it's the only one, right? If I walk in with 10 of these things and offer to sell it, what just happened to the price? It goes down because this isn't rare anymore. It's decreased in value. Does that make sense? Same thing happens with land. When there's just a whole ton of land suddenly for sale, the price drops. Investors go in and they buy land really cheap, so their mortgage payments are real low, right? Does that make sense? So they can sell their food grown out here in the provinces somewhere for much cheaper than the Italian farmers can sell theirs. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If you buy land at a lower price, or say if you're in Italy and you buy land at a really high price and your mortgage payment is like, I don't know, $2,000 a month, you have to sell that much food every month to make your payment and keep your land. Does that make sense? If you fall behind in the payments, you get foreclosed on. You lose your land. Or you get your car dispossessed or repossessed, repoed. So you've got to make that $2,000 a month. So food grown in Italy is expensive because the farmers have to make that money. Does that make sense? But out here in the cheaper land that's been conquered and basically stolen and then just suddenly put up for sale, people who buy land way out in the provinces, their mortgage payment might be $100. So what do they do with their prices for the food they grow? They sell it for less, for cheaper. They Walmart each other, basically. Because when you have a lot of companies selling the exact same product, if you go to buy a water bottle off the shelf at a store, and you see like 20 different companies all selling water bottles and they're all the same, which one do you buy? Whichever one's cheapest, because you, the buyer, wants to save money. Just like when I go to the grocery store, I go to the really cheap one, because I don't have a lot of money. I don't go to the expensive one. I go to the one where I can get the same amount of food for a third of the money I would spend at one of the upper end stores. Does that make sense? Same thing happens in the whole Roman Empire. Suddenly, really inexpensive food, cheap food to buy, isn't just being sold in provinces, but they put it on boats and they send it back to Italy. Because they know that the food being sold in Italy right now is really expensive from the Italian farms. So these companies go in, they buy a huge amount of land at low prices in the provinces. They grow the food not for those people in the provinces, but they put it on boats and send it back to Italy because they know they have guaranteed customers because they have lower prices. Does that make sense?
Are they using the same currency, or is it just trade at this time?
Well, the Roman Empire is developing its kind of unified currency, but it's just starting. So sometimes you do have to use the currency of the places you've conquered because sometimes that's kind of the only stuff around to use. But the Romans will build up their currency over time. Well, what's the natural result of this economic system? Of cheaper imports?
Globalization or capitalism?
Well,
Economics, or what do you mean?
Well, what happens to the people in Italy, the farmers in Italy?
Hungry, start losing their land.
Yeah, they're going to start losing their land.
When you import more than you export, then the value of all of your domestic goods goes down, and then the economy starts to a slow implode or recession.
Yeah, well, that's a whole another level of economics I want to get into. But the Italian farmers are being Walmarted. They have to sell their food at $2,000 a month, or else they're going under. They know it. They're getting foreclosed on. Suddenly, food is entering Italy for $200, a tenth of the price. And the Italian farmers lose customers. They can't get enough money to make their payments. They lose their land. They get foreclosed on. The smarter Italian farmers who see that this is happening fairly quickly after the end of the Punic Wars, they start selling their land because they know once this foreclosure crisis hits, the value of land that they can sell for is going to go down. Does that make sense?
So the government wasn't involved with this?
The government's heavily involved.
I mean, but backing up the farmers.
They didn't do any.
The,
we're paying
the
taxes.
government will not bail out the farmers.
Oh, okay.
Just like in the last housing crisis, people had bought houses at inflated prices. I mean, right here in Fontana, right? I mean, right down the street. And when suddenly a lot of people couldn't make those payments, a lot of people got foreclosed on. And if you wanted to buy a house, you could buy a house from someone who had bought it at a really high level. You could pay like $600,000 for their house. But there's another one right next door that just got foreclosed on. You could buy that one for $200,000.
Because it's the actual value.
Yep, because those people couldn't make their payments, they got foreclosed on, and the bank just wants to sell it to whoever to recoup their losses. So the value of houses crashed, and crashed hard. Does that make sense? Same thing's happening to the Italian farmers with the price of their farmland. Once the foreclosure wave hits, it takes everybody's value down, and it just wipes them out. The Italian farmers are economically destroyed. And suddenly, there's a lot of land throughout Italy that you can buy really cheap. Just like in the housing crisis starting in, 2007?
Yeah, well, 8.
There's a lot of houses you can buy out there really cheap. It's the exact same process and the exact same result. The government did not come in and bail out those homeowners, or the Roman government didn't go in and bail out or do anything for those landowners. And they suffer catastrophically. I mean, they're kicked out of their land and they starve. Or they, like in the housing crisis, they go and try to find family members or something to live with.
That's probably how he made his money, I'm thinking. Because I'm pretty sure his property is recreation.
Well,
But it's not for
just
a while.
like in the housing crisis, people with a lot of money, cash millions of dollars in a bank account, suddenly the housing prices are down less than a third of what they used to be. And you saw this in 2009, 2010. Some companies went up and didn't just buy houses, they bought
bonds.
streets.
I made a movie
All
about that.
houses on the street. I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember, by this point it's getting to be 10 years ago. You could go look for a house to buy, and you could look down a suburban street, and every single house had a for sale sign on it.
Yeah.
Up and down the street. The whole street was foreclosed. Right?
Smart. Yeah.
Well, is it smart? Is it immoral? Is it evil?
Call it smart.
There's an old saying, I don't know if you've ever heard this, that fortunes are built on crime. And the bigger the fortune means the bigger the crime. That the only way to get rich is to steal someone else's value, to figure out a way to get their money. What the money, like if we're in a really great society, we'd all have the exact same amount of income, and it'd be really fair. And if you're going to get rich in that system, you have to figure out a way to get someone else's money. So crimes lead to wealth, even if it's not an official crime where you go to jail. It's a crime against morality. It's an unethical thing to do, and that the bigger fortune you have, it just means the more crimes you've committed, or you committed one big crime to get that money right out at the beginning. You ever hear that saying? That's economics. And people who build up that kind of extreme wealth, they're the ones who get into power through corrupt systems. Does that make sense? They're the ones who have enough money to bribe lawmakers to build systems that are favorable to themselves.
Absolute power corrupts absolute.
Yeah. And way back in Rome, to get back to the main point, somehow, to wander back to the main point, I guess. Large landowners, just like big wealthy corporations today, went out and bought whole streets worth of houses during the crisis as an investment. The landowners did the same thing. Suddenly there's all this cheap land to buy in Italy because of the foreclosure crisis, and they went out and bought huge parcels of land and then they kind of sometimes, or a lot of times, dug up the crops and replanted to try to figure out a different crop to sell, because what they were planting before there isn't a market for it anymore. It's not profitable. So the big investors went in and bought up sometimes thousands of acres of land and tore out all the crops and replanted something else. Especially these so-called luxury goods of the ancient world, like grapes to make wine, olives, or meat sources, cattle, or other specialized foods that are really expensive, or largely are food for the rich. Does that make sense? So yeah, it's big money going in as an investment, and trying to transform the investment to make it more valuable. It's the exact same process we see now with houses. And since the rich are going in and buying up all these foreclosed properties, what happens to the former farmers who used to work that land and own that land? These big rich people don't want to farm the land themselves, so sometimes they hire the exact same families to work the land just for someone else now. It's not their property. These giant parcels become known as latifundia, which basically means plantation. And some of these Roman landowners could own thousands and thousands of acres, which, you guys know what the size of an acre is? An acre is a lot of land. If you have a house and you go into your backyard, especially like one of these suburban backyards in Fontana, you might have 1/8 of an acre. So if you take your backyard and combine it with 7 of your neighbors' backyards, that might be an acre. That's 1 acre. That's a lot of land to work. And if you're talking about thousands of acres, I mean, you're talking about the size of modern-day cities sometimes. All owned by one person or one family as an investment. And it's just huge, huge amounts of property. And therefore, the rich are getting richer. The poor are getting poorer. And when you combine this with all the wars that Rome is fighting to conquer the lands in the first place, most of the slavery in Rome is a result of being a prisoner of war. Your army lost the battle and you were taken prisoner, so you're sold off as a slave. And with Rome fighting so many wars and winning so many battles and taking so many prisoners, they're flooding the slave market. So what happens to the price for if you want to buy a slave? Goes down dramatically. So now the rich can even buy more free workers to work their huge land holdings. So this whole system is just perpetuating and increasing the power of the super rich at the gross detriment to really everybody else. So slavery grows throughout the empire as a result of these wars, which again only helps the rich even more. You get the rise of new politicians in Rome. Especially this guy named Gracchus, who recognizes that the heart of this problem is really economic, and it has to do with the rich taking over property and enslaving or sending out the former owners and making them into just mere wage laborers. So Gracchus, he's a popular politician, especially amongst the people that are critical of this stuff, and he starts running for office and getting elected based on his idea to reform the land system. And while he is a senator, while he's in office, he proposes a law to limit the amount of land that one person could own, or one family. And his law would set the limit at 320 acres, which is still a lot of land. And Gracchus says, if you own 320 acres, you're rich in this market. But if you own over 320 acres, then the government will take the leftover part. So if you own 1,000 acres at the start when this law gets enacted, you'll keep 320 of it and the government will take the rest. And the government will split it up into small little pieces the part that it took, and give that out for free to the former landowners who were foreclosed on. Does that make sense? And Gracchus says this will solve the economic crisis and will stabilize the Roman economy.
They just gave it to them.
Well, this is his proposal. He has to get the rest of the Senate to vote to approve it, and he has to get it implemented. And a lot of the senators are hugely corrupt, so convincing them to change a system that's enriching them is not easy to do.
They're not trying to sell eyes to this.
Changing the rules. So he can't really just give this argument to the Senate because they're going to vote no. So what does he do? Goes to the people, starts giving big speeches and holding giant rallies because the people are on the side of this because they're mostly poor. They're going to benefit from it.
Yeah, that's all I have a question. How do they manage to, control the soldiers? Because I know they import soldiers and stuff like that, but I mean.
Well, he's in Rome itself. The soldiers aren't allowed into the city. He has bodyguards.
But I'm not
and
talking about
whatnot.
him. This is a little out of context. I mean, as a
Oh.
whole, just to mobilize all the troops and stuff.
Well, especially in these wars,
Did they have any incentives?
a lot of the soldiers get paid off by being given land out in provinces. The place where you, with the army, helped attack, and if you conquer it, a lot of soldiers are given like an acre or two, just as like a retirement payment. So, and the Roman soldiers are becoming so professionalized that they're actually making a salary. They're getting government pay. They're government employees. So they're making money to be soldiers. So in this economic crisis, just with the last one, a lot of people started volunteering for the military, right?
Yeah, me.
Because they needed jobs. There's no other jobs out there to get. And this is a government job. It's a guaranteed salary. So yeah, a lot of people joined police forces and because they're losing jobs all over the place. They didn't think there were other chances out there for them. Yeah, that's very common in economic crises. So Gracchus takes this proposal to the people, and they're very vocally supportive. And this starts to change some senators' mind, and it looks like this might actually pass and become law. But it stopped when Gracchus is assassinated. Yeah, and so there are all kinds of rumors about who's behind his assassination, and most people seem to believe it's the rich landowners who
Oswald.
want to kill him to make sure that the law stops. And 10 years later, his younger brother, Gaius, goes into politics and runs for office and proposes the exact same thing. And then Gaius is assassinated within 2 years of talking about this.
By John Wilkes. How about this story?
So these two are remembered in Roman history as like martyrs to the people. They rose up and were brave enough to clearly analyze the problem, propose a solution, and the corrupt forces took them out.
Did they have really patronage backgrounds or however you would say?
I can't remember that background. I have to look that up. But a lot of Roman politicians interpret this as a message from the rich. You don't talk about this anymore, else you're going to get killed. And even in the United States, when you look at the history of assassinations, it usually goes after the people that are proposing changes to make society better, especially for the poor. Right? It's Lincoln who ends slavery and gets killed. It's people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X who propose real equality in drastic ways that get killed. Or people who start talking about the inherent corruption within, like the Kennedys, they get killed. You don't usually see conservative leaders getting killed all that much in the United States. So, questions about, they're called the Gracchi brothers, and they're statues, and they're kind of immortalized in Roman legend afterward. No? Okay. All right. And this whole debate over the land reform kind of leads to a movement in politics where the old patrician groups kind of start to break down a little bit, but then they reform under a political party called the Optimates. And they're basically conservatives. They want to keep everything the same. If you take the general definition of conservatism to mean no big changes, just everything's all right the way it is. The Optimates are the conservative side. They talk about how great the Roman Republic is, and how great the Roman democracy is, and how dare you question it, and if we have problems, we should look back to our past and figure out how Rome was at the height of its glory in its early days. We should go back to that instead of making drastic changes for the future. And then you have the other side, which is basically the group, the people. They're called the populares, the party of the people, basically. And they are usually the ones who want big changes because they are the ones that are victimized by this system. So they want to change it. It's pretty simple.
Appeal to the mob?
Yeah.
Is that the families you're talking about?
No. The mob is like just the masses of people out there. So the Optimates say that the populares, they're like mob psychology, basically. A popular politician will stand up in front of a giant gathering and say something really emotional, and because the average workers out there, the Optimates say the average people, they're just not very smart. They're taken in very easily by these popular politicians. And so they don't know really what they're talking about. They get angry and they start uprisings. And they are the mob, the giant faceless group that could rise up at any time and kick the conservatives out.
Like what Plato said.
So, yeah. So you might see these two terms, Optimates and populares. They're basically the usual old patricians and the plebeians. So same kind of sources.
Sounds very familiar. I mean, I speak Catalan. That's like Spanish, but it's a little different.
Yep.
The words are exactly the same. Latin.
Yes, because Spanish comes from Latin.
Well, Catalan
As
is
a-
Indo-European / Latin.
Yeah. Rome will conquer so much of ancient Europe that a lot of European
Yeah,
languages
that's
are built out of Latin. So that's why if you study French and Spanish and Italian, they're very close to each other in their terms and their conjugations and their linguistic rules. Yeah.
Romanian too.
Yeah. So they're called the Romantic languages because they come out of Rome. They have basis in Latin. So, yeah. Okay. And this whole economic system, you can already see it impacting politics because they're assassinating people who propose big changes. Getting more into foreign policy, the early Roman foreign policy was this federation to guard their trade routes and bring the Italian cities together for self-defense. And that over time, as we talked about last time, grew into this growing and very large empire, all this stuff in red. And a lot of historians say that the Romans didn't really plan to conquer all this empire. They just get involved in all these wars and they end up winning, so they take lands piece by piece by piece. So over hundreds of years, the Roman influence over the Mediterranean grows and grows, and they have political problems as a result. One very smart politician named Marius figures out how to turn the empire into something that can launch his political career. So he's kind of an average politician out there, somewhat famous, but not the most famous Roman politician at all. And he figures out that there's so much unemployment out there in Rome that if he can get permission from the Senate to build an army, then he can hire all these unemployed guys and give them government jobs as soldiers. And if he pays them well, they'll be very loyal to him. And And when he runs for office in the next election, he'll have a lot of votes all of a sudden. He's like starting his own family, basically. Does that make sense? Starting his own party based in the loyalty of these soldiers because they like him. Because in this crisis, they need jobs, and he's giving them jobs. So Marius figures this out. And he goes to the Senate and says, we have this enemy out there on the periphery. They're causing us problems. So give me permission to build an army. I'll go out there and attack, and we'll win the war. And the Roman economy will be protected. And they give him permission to build this army. And since he's the one building it and he has the plan for the invasion, they make him the general of the army. And he hires unemployed guys. And he's exactly right. They become extremely loyal to him because they know where their paycheck's coming from. Does that make sense? And he launches a political career and becomes one of the most powerful politicians in Rome. So he takes the army and builds it into his own political machine, his own system for winning elections and staying in power. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Yes? No? Okay. Other politicians figure this out. And politicians, they're smart people. They adapt to change and new ideas often very quickly. So once Marius is successful at this, other politicians basically copy his idea, and war becomes a business for politicians.
Sounds familiar.
They build up armies, they launch invasions, they gain the loyalty, the hardcore loyalty of these soldiers, which means they have a voting bloc in the next elections and cyclical elections. So making an army and put in charge of an army is a means of launching big-time political careers. And this gets replicated. Other politicians do it over and over. And the long-term result is that this creates a need for war in the Roman government. Because all the main sources of power in Rome want war. Politicians want war because that gives them opportunities to build armies and create their own kind of private political parties, their own groups. The military leaders, the lower level, colonels and sergeants and whatnot, they like war because there's a possibility that they're going to get a land payment in the end, right? So it's a kind of investment. It's a risk for them because they're the soldiers, but there's an opportunity that they might, get a big chunk of land somewhere and they can not have to work anymore. They become landowners themselves, and it's a business investment. Because if Rome is launching more wars and conquering more land, that's more land, more cheap land to go out there and buy. So all the kind of sources of power in this society are immediately now pro-war. And they start launching wars all over the place for all kinds of ridiculous reasons. Reasons that sometimes don't even really make much sense.
So war with other people, not themselves.
Yeah, they're attacking foreigners, basically. And that's how you see Rome, the Roman Empire will grow beyond that red space on the map, and just little chunk by little chunk, they just keep expanding and expanding for a long time. War is a business. The most successful politician at this is a guy named Sulla. He got permission to build an army and launched his war and became very famous for winning. Then broke the law by taking that army without permission and coming to the city itself, coming to the capital city, Rome. And he overthrew the government and set himself up as king, as emperor. So he made promises to the conservative Optimate party. So, they couldn't stop him. He had control of a big chunk of the army. So they're willing to make deals with him based on his promises. He basically knocks out the populars, knocks them out of office, and sets himself up as dictator. And of course, he justifies this saying, I'm going to stabilize the Roman government, I'm going to solve all these problems, I'm going to make life better for everybody, it's just I'm an absolute authority, which is usually what dictators do. I have a great idea to solve this crisis we're in. Just give me all power in government. And we're seeing this happen most recently right now in the Philippines. The Filipino president is launching a war on drugs that is looking extremely brutal.
Didn't he cuss out President Obama, I think?
Well,
Yeah.
there's some controversy about
Yeah.
exactly what he said. It seems like American media really misrepresented exactly what he said.
Same thing in Turkey, though.
Yeah, it's happening in Turkey.
Staged a military coup.
Yeah.
That's the sixth time it's happened in
Yeah.
the past 10
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
And other dictators say the same thing. We have the great idea for how the society should be run. So put us in power, and anyone who complains about what we're doing is automatically an enemy of the people, right? And they must be punished.
Sounds like North Korea.
Yeah. And
Vietnam.
Stalin
Yeah.
and Hitler and many other dictators, horrible dictators throughout human history, they all say that thing. I know what's causing the problem. Just give me the power to fix it.
Only I can fix
Yeah.
the problem.
And he said the same thing, and
It sounds like Trump.
well, it sounds like a lot of politicians. But that's one of the fears of recent elections in the United States. You have people that have these messages, and they seem very angry, and they're getting a lot of support. So we'll see what happens. But Sulla goes into office in 88 BC as dictator. He basically takes over. And he executes huge amounts of people who complain against him. Thousands of people in Rome who just complain about the amount of power he was given. He has them killed. So he's obviously a dictator. He chooses to retire 10 years later and kind of hands power off to someone else, and that person gets overthrown, and the republic comes back, the democracy comes back. But you can see just, this is how the artist drew his face, right? This is how the artist wanted the Romans to remember him. What do you think of this face? Does he look like a nice guy?
Very aggressive.
Oh, he's dominant. He's full of hatred and power and will destroy anyone who goes against him. And you have to remember with Greek and Roman statues, they were painted to be very lifelike. Like if you're standing in front of the statue, you think it's the actual person. So they would have found the perfect paint for his skin tone, and like just across the board, it would have been a perfect rendition of him. But the paint has since flecked off, so we're left with just the rock itself, the statue. But I mean, that's a scary looking guy, right? So he becomes a hated figure in Roman political history and an example for later Romans to remember. You don't want to give this much power to one person because they can do this. They can make themselves into a new Sulla. So he's remembered like the Hitler of his time, basically. Does that make sense? And the biggest accusation you can ever say against anyone in like European or American politics today is to say that they're talking like Hitler. And you're seeing that flung around all over the place, right? Not just now, but it has been for at least the last 15 years. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, so that's Sulla. Even after Sulla, though, I mean, the Republic comes back, but it comes back in the old form. The same form that it was corrupted. So the Senate can't really figure out how to stop these generals from, these politicians from taking power. So the best the Senate could figure is, we have these big long-term problems, and the Senate's too corrupted to come up with very good solutions. So they hand these problems off to what they call special commanders, special investigators, basically, that are sometimes generals of armies, depending on the problem. So often they'll say, it's this foreign group that's causing all of our problems. It's like a scapegoat. So let's build an army, appoint a special commander to head the army, and send them off to invade, and that'll solve the whole economic crisis. That's like saying that North Korea caused the housing crisis in the United States, which is ridiculous, but it's an easy scapegoat. Does that make sense? So these generals start coming up, and they have no term limits. They're in power as generals. And these special commanders start using their troops as political machines to launch political careers. So that's the system we're getting involved with now. And the most famous special commander is named Pompey. He gets permission to build an army, and he says that pirates out here in the Eastern Mediterranean, that they're causing harm to Roman trade, they're disturbing the trade routes, and so Pompey says, give me an army, I'll go out there and attack the pirates and destroy them, and that'll solve our economic crisis. And the Senate agrees, so he's given an army. And he goes out to the Eastern Mediterranean launching these invasions, but doesn't stop with attacking the pirates. He actually lands and starts attacking southward, getting close to Egypt, which is an independent area still at this point. And that scares the hell out of the Roman Senate, because they figure if he invades and conquers Egypt, he will have access to so much wealth, so much gold. And he'll be so popular throughout Rome as like this great war hero that he might just come back to Rome and just take over the government and make himself into a new Sulla. So the Senate appoints 2 new armies to 2 new generals, one named Crassus and one Julius Caesar, like as a just-in-case force. Just in case Pompey tries to come back with the army to invade Rome and set himself up as dictator, the Senate creates 2 new armies under these guys. Does that make sense? So this is where Caesar enters the picture, or the textbooks at least. He's already a general and a politician.
I've never seen Historia Civilis on YouTube.
No.
Well, they go into depth on like a lot of these things.
Yep, and probably a depth we're not going to achieve in the next 15 minutes. And there's a TV series, Rome, from like 10 years ago or something. And whose name did you say?
It's called like Historia Civilis, but it's really good. They have like
people's history. But if you type people's history into YouTube or whatever, you're going to get, there's a lot of famous books in U.S. history called People's History of the United States, so you might find that instead. So you might have to go with the Latin version of it. But Pompey, at this point, shocks everybody by coming back to Rome by himself. He leaves his army kind of on the doorstep of Egypt. And he comes back to testify in front of the Senate. He says, I had no plans to attack Egypt, really. It's not what I wanted to do. He said, I was just taking up land in the Eastern Mediterranean to pay off my soldiers for their bravery and their conquest. He said, I just wanted a little bit of land to especially pay off the officers so that they can have a nice retirement and they can become landowners and they don't have to work anymore and whatnot. Does that make sense? So Pompey says, nothing to worry about with me. I'm not trying to overthrow the government or anything like that. And Pompey asked for the permission to redistribute the land to his soldiers. And at this point, the Senate makes an unbelievably stupid series of mistakes. Number one, the Senate is hesitant to give Pompey the permission to give the land to his soldiers. So that angers Pompey and makes him worried, right? Because he's made promises to these soldiers. At the same exact moment, the Senate tries to disassemble the armies given to Crassus and Julius Caesar. So they anger Pompey, and then they anger their 2 what-if generals. So they pissed off all 3 at the same time, which is, politically a really stupid thing to do. And if you're going to anger one enemy, then you should make as many friends as you want to fight with you just in case. Does that make sense? So these 3 generals are all feeling kind of kicked around by the Senate, and they don't really trust the Senate anymore. So they come together in a meeting, and they decide to combine their 3 armies and overthrow the government and just take over themselves. and basically make themselves into co-kings. They call themselves the triumvirate, which translates as the rule of three. So they're like tri-kings, basically. Does that make sense? So the lesson there is don't piss off all your enemies at the same time. So questions about any of this? And we're skipping past all the negotiations and the backstabbing and whatnot. And there's an infinite amount of details about this that historians have
Is
written
this already
about.
after they're like trying to arrest Caesar? Aren't they trying to like get him in a lot of trouble?
Well, some people are trying to get him in trouble, but he's very smart.
Because I know like he, the only way he wasn't tried was because he was running a province or whatever. And you
We'll get into that in a
Yes,
little
I'm
bit.
sure.
Yeah. But the problem for these three guys is that none of them trust the other two. They each want to knock out the other two and make himself into the one emperor of the whole place. Does that make sense? So they're already conspiring and trying to figure out how to knock out the other two guys. Crassus figures that the best way that he can accomplish this is to launch an invasion way far east. I mean, this is the Mediterranean Sea right here. So he wants to go way out to like the old Persian Empire and conquer a huge amount of land. He thinks that'll make him into such a hero that he can make himself into emperor by popular demand. Does that make sense? It doesn't work out that well for him. He starts on this invasion eastward. He loses the battle and is actually killed on the battlefield. So Crassus is out pretty quickly. That didn't work out too well for him. Caesar has the same idea, except he wants to go west. So he gets an army, goes west from Rome, and attacks this place out here, which is called Gaul, which is basically modern-day France, and kind of getting closer up into modern-day Germany, going northeast. And his invasion is actually successful, and is unbelievably brutal, and just massacres huge amounts of population out there. And in order to advertise how much of a hero he was, he wrote a book called The Gallic Wars, as a kind of testimony, a textbook of the history of these wars. And he sets himself up as governor over Gaul, which is, just look at the map, a gigantic territory with all kinds of opportunity for looting. And the Senate, under his and Pompey's control, they allow him to be governor over Gaul for a while. And he just loots the place, enriches himself and his family and all of his political friends back in Rome. So he's using Gaul as his bank account, basically, to build up support for himself. Pretty obviously, by this point, hoping to conquer all of Rome himself. And when the Senate, I think I have a slide for this, yeah. The Senate starts to fear Caesar much more than Pompey. So the Senate tries to give more soldiers to Pompey and makes friends with him, while at the same time refusing to renew Caesar's governorship over Gaul. So they're making friends with Pompey while trying to cut off Caesar's access to wealth. Does it make sense? Yes? No? Yeah. All right. So Caesar has a big decision to make. Is he just going to accept this and go back to Rome himself? I mean, he's already rich, but he wants power. So he makes the decision to take his army out of Gaul and march towards Rome and start a civil war to try to knock out Pompey and take over the government. So Caesar hates the senators because he says it's a big insult and he's going to go after them. So a lot of the senators really now go to Pompey's side in the civil war because Pompey offered to protect them. Does it make sense? And so this is going to be a gigantic war of Romans versus Romans. Basically Caesar's party versus Pompey and the Senate. And the biggest battle happens out here in mainland Greece called Pharsalus. And Caesar wins that battle and destroys Pompey's forces. And Pompey runs to Egypt, trying to escape, trying to survive. And Caesar takes his kind of unified Roman armies now and moves down to Egypt and starts threatening to invade Egypt in order to get his hands on Pompey and probably kill him. The Egyptian government's very worried at this point. They don't want to be invaded. They've been conquered before. They like having an independent government. So they start negotiating with Caesar, trying to avoid a conflict. And the Egyptians capture Pompey and cut his head off and send it to Caesar as a gift in a box, basically saying, "Here, we've killed your enemy. Please go home now. Leave us alone." And one of their main negotiators apparently is one of the queens of Egypt from the royal family named Cleopatra VII. And Caesar looks like he's ready to invade Egypt completely and just conquer the place and make it part of the Roman Empire. Cleopatra somehow convinces him to not do that. So there's many different interpretations of how she does that. One is that she's a really good negotiator, and she can convince him somehow. A lot of Romans come to believe that she seduced Caesar, and even had children with him, and that her ability to seduce him, her physical attractiveness, is like weakened him mentally to the point where he just gives in to anything she wants. Does that make sense? So a lot of people in Rome who don't like Caesar use this as a way to kind of insult him and claim that he's weak and shouldn't be trusted. That if you trust Caesar, you're really trusting his Egyptian mistress. So if you put Caesar in power, it's really like putting the Egyptians in control of Rome, which is ridiculous, but that's the accusation. So Caesar goes back to Rome, and he's obviously the leader of the government. I mean, everyone knows that. Caesar's big problem, though, is what kind of government does he want to run? Does he want to trying to run this kind of city council type democracy, the Senate? Does he want to put them back in power, even though they have shown their inability to govern this empire? Or does Caesar want to make himself into some kind of king because the empire needs like a head decision maker, like a head administrator to deal with the crisis? Does it make sense? And this seems to be the giant dilemma that Caesar has run into. And it's the big question in all of Rome, the whole empire. They're all asking really, what is Caesar going to do? And he thinks about it and thinks about it and thinks about it. Does anyone know what Caesar eventually does?
Dies.
Yeah, he does neither. He gets killed. So a lot of senators, during a meeting with him, became so afraid that he's going to kick them out of office and maybe massacre them all and just take over himself. They murder him.
Et tu, Brute?
Yeah. So the conspiracy is led by a guy named Brutus and another guy named Cassius. And they invite him to talk to the Senate, to negotiate, and he leaves his bodyguards behind outside the building. And the senators have knives underneath their clothes, and they reportedly stab him like 30-odd times. So they all took a turn in stabbing him, and he dies there that day. So that's the end of Caesar. Does that make sense? All right. This starts another problem. Who's going to take over the army? His most trusted lieutenant in the army, his second in command, is named Mark Antony. A lot of Romans liked Caesar. They trusted him, and so they're outraged at the senators. So a lot of the people out there are calling for the execution of all the senators involved in the conspiracy. Mark Antony sees this as an opportunity for himself, so he makes a deal with the senators saying, I will protect you and keep you in office, and the Senate will run Rome, but now they will owe him such a favor for keeping them alive that he will basically tell them what to do. That's his calculation. Does that make sense? Yeah. But a lot of the people in Rome are still pissed off. So another guy named Octavian, who was Caesar's adopted son, starts giving speeches and saying really insulting things about Mark Antony. Octavian is very young. He's only like 18 or 19 years old. So he is like the outraged voice from Caesar's family that starts calling for blood, the execution of the guilty senators. So a conflict is going to develop between Mark Antony and Octavian because they want two different things. Does that make sense? And another general gets involved named Lepidus, for good measure, another of Caesar's advisors. Eventually they come together and negotiate. They don't want another civil war. So they negotiate what becomes what they call the Second Triumvirate, the second rule of the three. And they basically agree to run Rome themselves. Yeah.
So after they killed him, they just went to work every day like it was normal?
Oh no, they're very much afraid for their lives. Some of them go into hiding. Some of them leave the whole empire. They go to Egypt or go some other place because they're afraid of just being killed on the streets. And others hire bodyguards, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. Yeah. So yeah. Other questions? The second triumvirate has the exact same problem as the first. Each of these three guys wants to knock out the other two and make himself into the one emperor. So let's see. Mark Antony, for some ridiculous reason, figured that launching that invasion eastward again was a good idea in the first place, even though it failed the first time. So he prepares an army to attack eastward. Now, he's not really going to get that chance. He first, though, wants to go to Egypt and negotiate with the Egyptians to make sure they don't attack him from behind as he's going east. So while he's in Egypt, apparently he meets Cleopatra and is supposedly seduced, and they seem to have children, so it seems that actually happened. But Cleopatra convinces Mark Antony now to keep Egypt out of this mess. Does that make sense? And Mark Antony kind of takes her on as a mistress. And Octavian hears about this, and this is scandalous stuff. So Octavian starts running around in Rome giving speeches and accusing Mark Antony of being another one of these kind of weak guys. Came in contact with that same woman, that same like evil foreign Egyptian woman. And if you give power to Mark Antony, you're really giving power to the Egyptians, and they're going to run Rome. Which is, again, kind of ridiculous, but in this climate of fear and hatred, a lot of people believe it. It's a very emotional moment. So Octavian says, I have a good answer. Why don't I get an army together and attack Mark Antony's army and kill him and Cleopatra and protect Rome from Egyptian influence? Does that make sense? So he's a very smart politician, understands what the people kind of want to hear, and feeds it to them. And so Octavian gets his army together, and he attacks Mark Antony's army in western Greece. At this point, the big battle hits at a place called Actium in western Greece, and Octavian's forces win. Mark Antony and Cleopatra run to Egypt to try to escape, and Octavian will invade Egypt to try to catch them. So when it looked like they were going to be caught, they both seem to have killed themselves. Which, in these kind of wars, is not really a bad choice, because if you get caught, you're probably going to be tortured to death or something. So they choose to die quickly rather than be publicly tortured for who knows how long until they die slowly. These wars are extremely brutal things and kill many, many people. in horrific ways. And during all this, Octavian takes the third guy, Lepidus, and just kind of puts him under house arrest in a palace in North Africa. So knocks him out pretty easily. And Lepidus doesn't want any of this. Octavian is showing himself to be a pretty brutal type of guy. So Lepidus actually chooses to stay in North Africa and avoid all this for the rest of his life. So he's not a big player in this anymore. Does that make sense? So Octavian is now, at the end of the war, the one unified leader of Rome, the undisputed. And he has to confront the exact same problem that Caesar confronted and never solved. How do you govern this place? Do you turn it back to the republic, the democracy, that was so corrupted that just had showed already, just empirically, by evidence, that it just couldn't run this empire? Or you try to take it over yourself, but if you take it over and make yourself into king, you will basically tell the Roman people, you don't have a democracy anymore. It's a new dictatorship. So what does he decide to do? Does anyone know? Any ideas?
Become king.
Yeah. He won't call himself king, though. This is the trick. Historians have called this the invisible monarchy, where the republic, the Senate, is technically running Rome. And Octavian tells the people that you have your democracy back. The Senate just kind of invites me to talk to them and advise them every once in a while. And he uses that advisor role to basically, behind the scenes, secretly run this place as king. But again, he can't say it publicly. He can't call himself king because that would prove that there's no real effective democracy. So he plays this political game for the rest of his life, for decades, about saying, I'm just an important person they want to talk to a lot from a rich family. Does that make sense? So we'll talk next time in much more detail about how he gets away with this and what this does for Rome.